There is a moment in every life that never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It doesn't leave evidence anyone else can point to. No one around you notices. The room stays the same. The air doesn't change. Conversations continue exactly as they always have. Yet somewhere beneath everything visible, a fault line opens, and nothing built before it ever stands the same again. I used to believe I understood myself, not perfectly, but precisely enough. Every decision had a reason. Every silence had a purpose. Every distance I created was intentional. I called it discipline. I called it clarity. I called it control. Only now do I realize something uncomfortable. Control is often just fear that has become intelligent. Fear learns quickly. It studies your habits. It memorizes your strengths. It even borrows your voice until every limitation sounds like wisdom. Eventually, you stop recognizing it as fear. You call it personality. You call it maturity. You call it who you are. That's the greatest deception of all. Because prisons become invisible the longer you live inside them. Walls don't need to be high when you've forgotten they exist. I spent years building those walls, not because I hated people, because I believed nothing valuable survives careless hands. So I became careful, then cautious, then distant, then impossible to reach. People assumed I was difficult, private, reserved, mysterious. They were wrong. I wasn't hiding from them. I was hiding from uncertainty. There is comfort in being unreadable. If no one reaches the center, nothing can ever disturb it, or so I believed. But certainty has a weakness. It only survives until reality asks a better question. And reality is patient. It never argues. It never forces answers. It simply waits. Then one ordinary day, without permission, without warning, it places something in front of you that your old beliefs cannot explain. Not a miracle, not destiny, not coincidence, just undeniable evidence that the story you've been telling yourself is incomplete. That is the beginning of every transformation. Not when something changes around you, but when the explanation you've depended on finally collapses. That collapse is quiet, almost invisible. No dramatic breakdown, no tears, no chaos. Only an unbearable silence. The kind of silence that asks, if this isn't who you are, then who has been living your life all this time? Most people run from that question. They replace it with distractions, noise, achievements, relationships, goals, anything that lets them avoid looking directly at themselves. I didn't. I stayed not because I was brave, because I couldn't leave once you've seen the fracture. You can't convince yourself the wall was never broken. Every certainty becomes suspicious. Every conclusion demands evidence. Every belief returns to the beginning for judgment, and somewhere inside that endless examination, you meet the one person you've successfully avoided your entire life, yourself. Not the version other people know, not the version you've performed, not the version you've defended, the one beneath all of it, the one who has been waiting in absolute silence, long before you ever learned how to explain who you were. And the terrifying part is realizing that stranger may be the most honest thing you've ever encountered. The strange thing about meeting yourself is that it doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like remembering. Not memories you can place on a timeline, not moments you can describe, something older than memory. A quiet recognition that the person you've been searching for was never hidden, only buried beneath years of adaptation. Every role, every expectation, every version of yourself created to survive, layer after layer, until the original shape became almost impossible to recognize. People call it growing up, learning how to fit, learning how to succeed, learning how to become someone the world can understand. But they rarely ask what disappears in the process. Every compromise leaves a mark. Every silence leaves an imprint. Every time you choose acceptance over authenticity, a small part of you steps further into the shadows, not dead, just waiting, placidly. The forgotten self is remarkably patient. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't demand to be seen. It simply watches year after year, waiting for the moment when the life you've constructed becomes too small to contain what you've refused to acknowledge. That moment arrived quietly, not as a crisis, as clarity. And clarity is dangerous, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unknow it. I began noticing how often I answered questions I had never truly asked myself. How many opinions I carried simply because they had become familiar. How many ambitions belonged to expectation rather than conviction. How much of my certainty had been inherited instead of earned. It was unsettling, not because I found lies. Because I found unfinished truths, pieces of myself abandoned halfway through becoming. Ideas interrupted by fear, dreams postponed until they no longer sounded like my own voice. There is grief in that realization, not grief for what happened, grief for what never had the chance to happen, for every version of yourself that quietly disappeared while you were busy becoming acceptable. No one teaches you how to mourn that. The world celebrates achievement. It rarely speaks about invisible loss, yet the deepest losses leave no witnesses. Only echoes. Echoes that surface in quiet moments, asking questions that success cannot answer. Who would you have become if fear had not chosen for you? Which parts of you are still waiting, not for permission, but for recognition? Those questions followed me everywhere. Not loudly, not relentlessly. Just persistently enough that ignoring them became harder than facing them. That is when I understood something I had resisted for years. Transformation is not becoming someone new. It is removing everything that convinced you that you already were. And that process is not beautiful. It is slow, uncomfortable, precise. It asks for honesty before confidence, humility before certainty, silence before answers. There comes a point where you stop asking how to return to who you once were, because you finally understand that person never truly existed. They were a collection of defenses, habits, expectations, carefully assembled identities mistaken for a soul. When those identities begin to fall away, the silence returns. But this time, it is different. It is no longer empty. It is spacious, a place where nothing needs to pretend anymore. And standing in that silence, for the first time in my life, I realized I was no longer afraid of not knowing who I was. I was afraid of finally finding out. There comes a point where searching becomes impossible. Not because every answer has been found, because the questions themselves begin to disappear. I spent years believing that understanding would arrive like certainty, a final conclusion, a permanent answer, a place where nothing inside me would ever move again. I was wrong. Understanding isn't a destination. It's the willingness to remain honest while everything familiar dissolves. That realization changed the way I looked at myself. I stopped asking, who am I supposed to become? And started asking, what still remains when every performance ends? That question doesn't produce comforting answers. It strips them away, piece by piece, until you're left with something that cannot be borrowed from anyone else. No title, no reputation, no expectation, no applause. Only awareness, pure, unfiltered, unavoidable. At first, I resisted it, not because it was painful, because it was simple. Far simpler than the complicated identity I had spent years constructing. I had mistaken complexity for depth. But depth doesn't need decoration. It doesn't need mystery. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply exists quietly, like the ocean beneath a storm, unmoved by the waves that convince everyone else the surface is the whole story. That's when I noticed something unexpected. Nothing outside me had changed. The same streets, the same conversations, the same faces, the same routines, yet everything felt different. Not because the world had transformed, because I was no longer looking at it through the same mind. Perception had shifted, and once perception changes, Reality follows, not the external world, the world you actually live inside. Every fear I had carried suddenly revealed its hidden purpose. It had never been trying to destroy me. It had been trying to protect an identity that had already outlived its usefulness. Every certainty I defended, every wall I built, every mask I perfected, had once served a purpose. I don't resent them anymore. I simply don't live inside them. There is freedom in that, not the loud freedom people celebrate. A quieter one, the freedom of no longer negotiating with your own reflection. The freedom of no longer performing strength while secretly fearing honesty. The freedom of standing in complete silence and finding that silence no longer asks you to become someone else. For the first time, I wasn't chasing meaning, I was creating space for it, because meaning cannot be forced. It arrives when resistance ends. And resistance had finally grown tired, not defeated, released. That was the moment everything became irreversible. Not because my life suddenly changed, because my relationship with myself did. There is no returning after that. No rebuilding the old illusions once you've seen the framework beneath them. No convincing yourself that comfort is the same as truth. You move forward, not with certainty, but with integrity. Not knowing every answer, yet refusing to betray the questions that matter. Maybe that is what transformation has always been. Not becoming extraordinary. Becoming honest enough that the extraordinary no longer needs to be invented. And as I stood there, with nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove, and nothing left to hide, I understood the quiet truth that had been waiting beneath every layer I had ever built. The strongest foundation isn't certainty, it isn't control, it isn't perfection. It's the courage to let reality reshape you without losing your willingness to face it. Because the life that begins after that moment isn't built on fear. It isn't built on performance. It isn't built on illusion. It is built on something far more difficult and infinitely more enduring: truth. And once truth becomes the ground beneath your feet, there is only one direction left to walk: forward. No one tells you what happens after the truth. They talk about awakening, about freedom, about becoming who you were always meant to be. They make it sound beautiful. It isn't. Because truth doesn't rebuild you. It removes everything that cannot survive being seen. And what remains is rarely what you expected. There is a silence that follows every collapse, not the silence of loneliness, not the silence of defeat. The silence that exists after an illusion has finished speaking. I know that silence now. It no longer frightens me. It examines me. Every morning it asks the same question. Not who are you? Not what do you believe? But what are you still pretending not to know? That question has no comfortable answer. Every time I think I've reached the bottom of myself, another layer disappears. Another certainty dissolves. Another explanation quietly falls apart. I used to think strength meant holding everything together. Now I understand something different. Sometimes strength is allowing the structure to fall because you finally recognize it was built on borrowed foundations. There is a strange peace in standing among the ruins, not because destruction is beautiful, because nothing false survives there. The ruins don't care about reputation, they don't care about success, they don't care how convincing your performance once was. They leave only what is real, only what can carry its own weight. And perhaps that is why so few people willingly walk into them. The cost of truth has never been pain. The cost has always been certainty. You cannot keep both. One must disappear before the other can exist. For years I chose certainty. Now I choose reality, even when it refuses to comfort me. Even when it exposes parts of me I would rather leave hidden. Even when it demands that I begin again without the protection of old stories. Because beginning again is not failure. Pretending you've never changed, that is failure. There was a time when I believed Identity was something to defend. Now I see it as something to refine, again, and again, and again. Not until it becomes perfect, until it becomes honest. Maybe that's the purpose of all this, not to become someone extraordinary, not to escape uncertainty, but to become so deeply aligned with truth that even your silence carries integrity, that even your doubts become sincere, that even your fear refuses to lie. If that's where this path leads, then perhaps the collapse was never the end. Perhaps it was the first honest foundation I had ever stood on. And for the first time, I don't need the future to promise me certainty. I only ask that it gives me enough courage to keep walking toward whatever is true, even if every step asks me to leave another illusion behind. There is a place beyond certainty, beyond fear, beyond the endless need to explain yourself. Most people never arrive there, not because the path is hidden, because the price of admission is everything you've mistaken for yourself. I understand that now. The person I spent years protecting was never my final form. It was a bridge, necessary, temporary, built to carry me across a version of life I no longer inhabit. For a long time, I believed growth meant adding something new. More knowledge, more discipline, more control, more answers. But every meaningful change in my life has come through subtraction. Less pretending, less certainty, less attachment to the stories I once defended as absolute truth. The strange part is, the less I carry, the more solid I become. Not because I've found perfection, because I've stopped trying to manufacture it. I've learned that the mind has an endless appetite for conclusions. It wants every mystery solved, every contradiction resolved, every uncertainty placed neatly into a category. But life refuses that kind of order. It unfolds. It contradicts itself. It asks questions that remain alive long after the answers have faded. Maybe wisdom isn't collecting explanations. Maybe wisdom is learning which questions deserve to remain open. There was a time when uncertainty felt like weakness. Now it feels like space. Space for growth. Space for correction. Space for realities I haven't encountered yet. That space no longer threatens me. It humbles me. And humility has become a better teacher than certainty ever was. I no longer need every chapter of my life to make perfect sense. I no longer expect every decision to guarantee the right outcome. I no longer confuse control with peace. Peace has a quieter voice. It doesn't demand. It doesn't persuade. It simply appears when the struggle to become someone else finally ends. That doesn't mean the journey is over. Far from it. If anything, this is where it truly begins. Because now every step is chosen consciously, not from fear, not from habit, not from the invisible weight of expectations that were never mine to carry. Each step becomes an act of honesty. Each decision becomes a conversation between who I was and who I am still becoming. I don't know where this road ends. Perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps becoming was never meant to have a finish line. Perhaps the purpose of life isn't arriving, but remaining awake enough to keep evolving. If that's true, then every ending is simply another beginning wearing a different face. And maybe that is the quiet truth I was searching for all along. Not that life becomes easier, not that uncertainty disappears, not that the future suddenly reveals itself, but that beneath every change, beneath every loss, beneath every unanswered question, there remains something that cannot be broken. A willingness to face reality with open eyes, a willingness to let truth reshape you again and again, a willingness to keep walking even when the destination disappears into the horizon. Because in the end, we are not remembered for the certainty we possessed. We are remembered by the honesty with which we lived. And if there is one promise I can make to myself from this moment forward, it is this: I will no longer build my life around the comfort of familiar illusions. I will build it around the quiet courage to meet each new version of myself without fear, without disguise, And without turning away, that is the only future worth becoming. And this time, I walk toward it with my eyes open.